Now, as most of you know, Fiona is a coal miner's daughter from Durham who made her way to the White House by way of Harvard to become an advisor to presidents, as Paul so very gladly told us. And she also advises other international organizations. And I know she has a very busy schedule here in the UK after she's leaving us. I believe she's going to meet some VVVIPs, some fellow VVVIPs, so she can't stay long. So if you want your book signed afterwards, and I'm sure you will, you need to get in there quickly. So Paul's already read out much of her book, her CV. And if you'll forgive me, I'm a little bit nervous, as I always am before these, when I start, my nerves settle down, but I think it adds a bit of excitement. I'm so really honored to be here, and I feel hugely excited about this event. But perhaps this one in particular, because I have found a few affinities with Fiona's story, with my own family's story. I mean, my mother is the youngest of 11 kids, daughter of a fisherman. Nobody could afford to go to university. I was the first person in my family to go to university. My aunt, did well in her career, but it was all hard scrabble. And then she was she was surpassed up the ladder by people who did go to university under her, and so I was really inspired by your story. My aunt is now reading your book as well. So what I aim to do with all these events is to keep them informal and chatty, as if we're sitting next to each other on a train or something, or a plane, getting to know you, and thus letting our audience get to know you as well. Let me see. So we are going to talk about Russia and Ukraine and Trump and blah, 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 but I mean, well, this memoir does include a few chapters related to Fiona's brief stint at the White House. It is overarchingly a personal story, and it is partly polemic. And I want to talk about the personal, but I want to talk about opportunity as well. That an opportunity, you say, does not materialize from thin air, and no one does anything alone. There is nothing for you here begins and ends with discussions about social mobility and access to quality, the tangible benefits to access to quality education. Could you expand on that? And could you tell us a little bit about how you got to Harvard, etc.?
Yeah, and look, I'm really thrilled to be here. I can see quite a few people I know. Mark Malcolmson sitting right there, very prominently. I'm sorry that some people are behind a pylon or a kind of metal pole here, but I'll try to move along without falling off the chair. In any case, I know you're all there. And all of this story that I'm telling in the book is actually relevant to where we are now, not just sitting here in the Conduit and Frontline Club with all of you, but also to, one of the reasons that we're in this dreadful situation with Ukraine and Russia centered around Donbass. And I just want to actually talk about Donbass for a moment because it's relevant to my personal story. So my father was a coal miner from the north of England, one of a long generation of coal miners. And County Durham and the coal miners of County Durham, the Durham Miners Association, have been twinned with the Donbass since the 1920s, since before the founding of the National Miners Union, since before the nationalisation, obviously, of the coal mines in the United Kingdom. And in fact, some of the deepest mines in Donbass were actually developed by Welshmen, Scotsmen. One of them is known as Yusivka, by a gentleman named Mr. Hughes. That's sort of a Russified version of this, because most people in Donbass were Russian-speaking, even if they weren't ethnically Russian. And bizarrely, lots of Welsh miners, Scottish miners, and miners from the northeast actually went to Donbass back in the 1920s. And I was recently at home in the last week. I went to Red Hills, the Pitman's Parliament, the head of the Durham Miners Association, which was set up in a really fabulous building paid for by the Jews of coal miners and opened up in 1913, 1914, just as the war got started. And they'd sent a delegation under a woman, a miner's wife who became a councillor, Mrs. Errington, to the Donbass in the 1920s, and they showed me the photo album of this. So everybody all dressed out in their Sunday best. Councillor Errington, despite being a miner's wife, and women just only having the vote, had this hat that was about this large. And all of the kind of pictures seemed very incongruous. And what I noticed right away was that the Donbass coal mine in the pictures was very much a showcase mine from the 1920s, the Bolshevik revolution, pristine, which was anything other than what the mines were in County Durham in the 1920s. And the message from Donbass in that period was, of course, the Soviet state was in charge of everything. This is the ultimate nationalized state-run industry. They were providing all these things for the workers, which, of course, we know was really kind of all a bit of a myth in any case. But they put on a good show, as you saw in all of these pictures. But what was happening in County Durham at the time was the miners were having to do everything for themselves, because the coal owners, just like later on, with the state when it was nationalized after World War II, did nothing for the miners at all. In fact, my great-grandfather, in the 1880s became one of the spokesmen for the coal miners after an absolutely awful accident in the mines in Seaham, in the Vane Temper Stewart mine, in which 180 men and 181 pit ponies, as a kid I always remember that figure because it was more pit ponies than men perished, and they were bricked up in the mine because the owner of the mine, Lord Londonderry, wanted to maintain the mine. And there was a terrible fire, and they didn't want the fire to spread. This is under the sea, 2.3 miles out under the sea, where people had to basically go an hour before they got out there because he could replace miners but couldn't replace the mine. And this sparked off one of the biggest strikes of the period, and people like my great-grandfather became spokesmen to try to push back for miners' rights. And the miners, with all of their dues, paid for rehabilitation, paid for everything that they were basically came to them in terms of the welfare of the miners. It was all these were miners' welfare societies. Now, why that is relevant to my story is that when I was born in 1965, the coal mines were all closing down. And my dad, had lost one job after another because every pit closed. Nobody had any qualifications to speak of in terms of resumes. I mean, Paul was making kind of joke about my resume, and I was thinking it was an irony because my dad didn't have a resume. My dad just had a worker's record, a little kind of slip of paper to say that he worked in this pit and that pit and the other pit, and people would vouch for them. Somebody would say, well, Alf's a good worker, you should take him in the next colliery. And then when the collieries closed down, there wasn't much else. He worked in a steelworks for a while at Walsingham, that closed down. He went to a brickworks, that closed down. Eventually becomes a hospital porter at the bottom rung of the economic ladder, with no qualifications. Every other porter in the hospital at that point, which became the largest employer in the town, was a former miner, except one person who used to drive a bread truck until, you got bread in packages, from the local supermarket, so nobody delivered bread anymore. So he was out of a job as well, became a porter. And he used to joke that he was very good at delivering things, so that's why he got the job as a porter, pushing patients around rather than, big bread trays. And basically, the bottom was falling out of the economy, but there was still this desire to get ahead and to do something. And looking at Mark, Malcolmson here, City Lit, and at URUN, all of the kind of city university here, the miners didn't really have that, but they had these lecture series, all of these societies, and I got some money to study Russian from the miners of the Donbass in 1984, because this was during the miners' strike. And there were miners' unions in the Soviet Union, yes, a lot of them were run by the KGB, but there were actually miners did have a lot of solidarity. And because of this twinning, going back to the 1920s, when there was the huge miners' strike, though my dad was no longer a coal miner and hadn't been actually for quite some time, the money from the miners of the Donbass, in solidarity with the miners from then of the National Miners' Union, went to County Durham. And when I was looking for some money to assist me in learning Russian and going on an intensive Russian language course, I went up to the Pitman's Parliament, to the inquiries window, and asked about this, and they looked up my dad's work record, and I got a small grant to be able to go to Norwich, to the University of East Anglia, to basically do an intensive Russian course. So one of the reasons that I made it from, as I joke in the book, the coal house to the White House, is because of this weird decades-long solidarity between the miners of Donbass, the focus now of this huge battle in Ukraine, and miners of County Durham, and the miners' aspirations for themselves and their children, to basically get an education, but to do it for themselves. And what happened in the 1980s, which is one of the themes of the book, and it's relevant today because the populist politics we've seen in the United States, the United Kingdom, and also in Russia, where the base of support for people like Trump, for people like Putin, comes from the old Rust Belts, the old industrial areas where people lost their jobs, their identities, and the ability to do something for themselves and had to become dependent on handouts, including from the state, is because of this massive and very rapid deindustrialization. In the 1980s, when we had privatisation here in the UK, nobody thought about the fact that in the places like the North East and the Midlands and many other places, everybody worked for a nationalised industry. I didn't know anybody apart from the plumber and the electrician, or maybe the person who owned the corner shop who didn't work for British something. And so when there was that privatization, they were all shrunk down. There was no demand for people like my dad who had no qualifications. And they weren't in the ability, because there wasn't, City Lit, there wasn't the kind of network of, reskilling, the further education colleges, at least within accessible distance, because people didn't have cars, and the buses might not go to them. They might have to cycle or walk somewhere. They couldn't find new jobs. They lost their opportunity, and those festering grievances fed into much of the populist politics. But I still managed to somehow benefit from the vestiges of this desire for the miners of County Durham to do some things for themselves. So that's tying it all together in one, I hope.
And it was your father,
comprehensible bundle there.
Your father who told you there was nothing for you here, isn't it? I mean, you had a stable family background. Your mother was a nurse. They really encouraged you to go out and about, and it was your father who said, "There's nothing for you here. Go." That's where the title of the book comes from.
It was, because in 1984, when I was leaving school, and I did have the chance, which wasn't the case for many of my friends, and like you said, first people in the family to go to university, to college. In 1984, 90% of British youth, I mean, some of you who will remember this, had nothing immediately to go on to after leaving school. It was the peak of the unemployment crisis among youth in Britain. So 10% had something, and out of that, 5 or 6% in total maybe went to university, polytechnic, college vocational school. Others might have had an apprenticeship. But 90% of people were still trying to find something. And in somewhere like Bishop Auckland in County Durham, where the bottom had fallen out of the economy, the whole of County Durham, Concert Steelworks closed down, the wagon works at Shildon, all of the jobs that a lot of my classmates who were boys would have had following their father into something, it was impossible. And the schools weren't set up. The old grammar school system had disappeared at this particular point. They weren't really set up to help people think about what they were going to do if the factory job wasn't there, or the pit job, or the wagon works wasn't there. And I had this incredible opportunity to go to university. Durham County Council would pay for it. They had maintained somehow their educational cultural budgets throughout all of this. But my dad was basically saying, if you do that, there's nothing for you here, pet. You're going to have to think about going somewhere else. That somewhere else ended up being the United States. But I don't think that was kind of quite what all of us had in mind. But I remember the moment that he said to me this very vividly. I'll never forget the walk from, I had a part-time job in a local pub, which was another growth industry there. People took a lot to drinking a lot, in that moment. And so there was always a bar job. And my dad was basically saying, you're going to have to think about what else you were going to do. And I had started that whole process of thinking, what am I going to do?
I mean, there's a lot of points I can touch on here. Where do I go with this? Let's sort of draw it back again, though, to the populism. So you write on page 171 that one of the best explanations for the layman of what populism is and what it means and how it arises. And you say cultural despair and the rise of populism. Throughout history, you say, populists have offered compelling narratives for people who feel they have lost their identities and cultural moorings, as well as their jobs and economic turndown, and at times of rapid social change and political uncertainty. Populists like Putin, however you say his name, provide straightforward, plain-speaking explanations for people's misfortunes. And I think that's why, how Trump, he used the populist, rule book, didn't he? The strongman, because he's just plain speaking, isn't he? I guess you could say. But also, look, Francis Fukuyama, writing in the Weekend FT, said, we cannot take the existing liberal world order for granted. It will disappear the moment we lower our guard. It's something we must constantly struggle for. That liberalism has decline, not just because of the rise of authoritarian powers, but also because of the turn towards populism, liberalism and nationalism within long-standing democracies such as the US and India. And one of the great things about this book is the way that Fiona, she really does a deep dive examination of how the US, the UK, and Russia have all these similarities that you would never have, thought about, at first glance. And she says, gosh, I went to Russia and I realized how similar what was going on in Russia was to what was going on in the UK. And then when I went to the US, I thought, oh gosh, what's going on in the US is similar to what I saw in the UK and in Russia. So for that, it's a fascinating read in itself. There's a story also when you go to Moscow to study Russian. You say you were kind of, I guess, a bit like me. You sort of didn't really kind of fit in, I suppose. But you were a SWAT, Anybody would say that, with your pigtails that were burnt by a school bully. And you went to Moscow and you realized, actually, hey, I kind of fit in here. When they say, hey, what does your father do for a living? You said, oh, and isn't it really, and your head was kind of turned by that experience there.
Yeah, I was really kind of taken aback. 1987, I get a scholarship through the British Council to go and study in the Soviet Union. And it's the first time I've actually lived in a big city in Moscow. And I was expecting it to be so radically different. Obviously it's Moscow, it's Russia. There are huge differences, of course, just to be very clear. But coming from the deindustrializing northeast, I walked to Moscow and I thought, God, it's just Newcastle on steroids. The shops are empty because, in a lot of the northern towns, the shops are actually boarded up because nobody had any money to buy anything. It wasn't because there wasn't supply, just there wasn't demand because nobody had any cash. In Russia, of course, of the Soviet Union, I realize it's the opposite. And of course, you get the whole different economic perspective from this. It's the fault of central planning. It's run out of steam. People actually do have quite a bit of cash, in theory anyway, right? And but there's nothing to buy. I had one episode, which I recounted just the other day, of going into this supposedly famous Hungarian store, Balaton, that was supposed to sell Hungarian delicacies. And all it had was black Hungarian leather boots in one size, women's boots. They were all in my size. I thought, God, I could be wearing boots the rest of my life. I should just buy them all up. But then I thought, well, that's a bit weird. Where's all these other Hungarian delicacies? Because obviously, the supply chain had broken down. But the thing that I noticed the most was there was a lot of social mobility. Everybody that you looked at had come up, admittedly it's the Communist Party, but come up through the system. They were all the kids of workers, coal miners. They were one generation away. They were all the people, because it would have been the first time to go to college, it was all being paid for. And what I was doing to them was just kind of fairly unremarkable. And everybody had heard of County Durham and the coal mines. Not because of the 1920s ties with the Donbass, but just coal miners. This was kind of the working class aristocracy, as it actually was back in the day in the UK for a while. And whereas I was constantly having to explain myself to my fellow Brits about, oh, that's where you're from, is it? And, that's what your father does. And they were like, oh, that's great. And so this was a bit of a mind-warping experience. It was also quite striking about how clear it was that the Soviet Union was on its last legs. And again, if I hadn't come from, the Northeast and all I'd done was kind of think about going to the Bolshoi and all the great cultural things, which I did as well, and I was just blown away by it all, I might not have noticed this. But I noticed that, for example, I went down some little streets between my institute, the Maurice Teresa Institute of Foreign Languages, and the really imposing, incredible building of the Russian Foreign Ministry. And there was a little wooden house with chickens in the garden, like my granddad had in the back garden, in the mining village. I thought, what? Chickens in the garden? I mean, you imagine going down Chelsea or something, or, the back of, Whitehall, and somebody's got a little wooden hut with chickens in the backyard. I mean, maybe the Queen's got some chickens. It's not like the pelicans, in kind of St. James's Park. It's chickens running around. And then I realised, of course, that there was so much deprivation there as well because of the, the breakdown in the system. And that just like the miners needed to kind of feed themselves with chickens, Russians had to as well. In fact, the whole economy had collapsed to such an extent that most people in Russia, I ended up writing an article about this later, were feeding themselves from their allotments or their uchastki with potatoes they grew, the vegetables they grew, and that this, clearly this system was in really big trouble, of course, for a whole host of different reasons. I mean, in the book, I do make some fairly stark comparisons that people said, oh, come on, wait a minute. There was a whole different structure, but I wanted to kind of bring out the fact that if you attune to it, just as I was attuned to, deindustrialization and deprivation, you kind of see then points of contact. And as I said, the political outcomes are pretty similar. Because when people feel they've lost something, they lost their identity, they're struggling, the state isn't providing, if it's had to step in, they don't have the wherewithal to do things for themselves, although, basically raising chickens and growing vegetables is a way of doing things for themselves. But you become then, I would say, prone or vulnerable to exploitation. And I'd also seen during the miners' strike, the Durham Miners Association was, again, a mutual assistance society as much as anything. And when it became part of the NUM, its whole perspective changed. And you saw people then, being a bit Soviet and Bolshevik, ruling with an iron fist through the rule book. And look, the miners' strike and Arthur Scargill was the epitome of populism. There was, great big kind of fights in the National Miners' Union, and I'd sort of seen this all play out during the miners' strike. Nobody I knew was a fan of Arthur Scargill. And, of course, nobody was a fan of Margaret Thatcher either, but they said they were just as bad as each other, and you looked at them and actually they looked quite similar. Bouffon blonde hairstyle, piercing eyes, fight of the titans, both of them wanting to win and defeat everybody else, and the miners were collateral damage. And they were all speaking in the name of the people, or doing things on behalf of something else, and depriving the individual members of the miners' union or everybody else of individual agency and collective action. And so, the Soviet Union was the epitome of that.
Yeah, I remember going to Moscow, to St. Petersburg about 20 years ago, and it felt like it was a facade. The buildings were painted on the outside, but actually bits would sort of crumble off, and you'd have to be in danger of falling plasterwork, And you'd go inside buildings, and there were, if you went to a museum, I went to the Hermitage, and it was sort of, spare inside, and basic cafes, and they wouldn't serve you. They basically tell you to, F off, because they couldn't be bothered, and it was a strange place, and at that time, and I imagine it still may be. But let's go back to Moscow and your. I want to talk about the kind of serendipitous encounters in your life, and I'm a person who thinks that, and I feel and believe that you make your own luck, and in many ways you have. As Picasso says, busy hands find their own luck. But in many ways also, it was almost as if your life has been fated in a way. You seemed at the beginning of your personal and professional story to have many serendipitous encounters where what might have seemed at the time to be misfortune, for example, turned into good luck. For example, being turned down by Durham and finding yourself at St. Andrews instead. Have I got that right?
Well, it was actually that was in school. I got a scholarship after taking the 11 plus to the local private girls' school, but my parents couldn't afford the uniforms, the books, and the bus fares, so I didn't take it, and stayed in the local comprehensive school instead, which led to me through another path, and I got turned down by Oxford.
Oxford, it's Oxford. I thought it was Oxford.
There's a whole other story.
I know that interview. Okay, was it Oxford or Durham? Yeah. I have read this
Durham
book.
comes into it as well.
Yes,
anyway,
I'm sorry, I got confused.
Paths,
so you had an interview with Oxford, which didn't go very well, but it meant that you ended up you found yourself at St. Andrews University, and on the first day there, was it a recce with your cousin Jeff, or maybe you were lost, and you asked for directions from a chap. And the first person you encountered, asked for directions, happened to be the director of the Russia Studies Department.
Yeah, exactly. And he was from Yorkshire, and so he heard our northern accents and us, whittering on about what we were doing, where were we. And it's not a big place, St. Andrews, so it's pretty ridiculous to be lost as soon as you got off the bus. And he walked over and introduced himself, and I was like, oh my God, he's Mr. Sullivan, Professor Sullivan, the head of the Russia thing. And he immediately got his keys and took us into the Russian department, and that was that. And I thought, wow, where did he appear from? But it was actually just normally, this was, just one of these random chants. He was obviously walking by. It wasn't like he just dropped from the sky.
Some people say there's no such thing as chance, random chance. And then there was the encounter in Moscow with Robert Legvold, pardon my pronunciation, leading to your meeting with Mike Bird, leading to the Maurice Thorez Institute. Tell us about that. Tell them the story about you making coffee, or you were volunteering, then you were spraying Tom Brokaw.
Yes, so again, a lot of things in life, right, for everybody here. I bet you're all thinking about timing and the kind of lucky chance, and that's why I say in the book, you can read off someone's resume and it sounds all very linear, and you think, oh, that was kind of amazing, when you put together all of this, and it all seems straightforward, and most of it isn't. A lot of things that we do in life are because of a chance encounter or something that inspires you, or something that goes wrong. And sometimes it's just the kind of a question of realizing, okay, another door has opened. I've got a lot of stories where I've gone in the wrong door as well. In one interview, I went into the broom closet and shut it behind me and was like, oh, shit. And then I realized I shouldn't have said that so loudly, and I kind of come out and say, sorry, where's the door? But there's sometimes that going into the wrong door can actually lead to something really interesting. And in this case, I was in Moscow for, very fortuitously, the Gorbachev-Reagan summit of the summer of 1988. And I decided to study Russian against the backdrop of the Euro missile crisis that some people in here will remember, thinking we're all going to be blown up in nuclear Armageddon, you remember CND and the peace movement, Agreement, Common Women. We've been celebrating a lot of that recently. And the Euro missile crisis, the crisis over the stationing of SS-20 and Pershing missiles in Europe, basically dominates my entire teenage years and early college years from 1977 to 1987. And the year I get the scholarship to go to the Soviet Union is the year that Gorbachev and Reagan signed the INF treaty. The irony of this is I actually am there in the Trump administration when we pull out of it in the United States as well, so that's another strange development in life. But I'm there as Gorbachev and Reagan, all that hopeful period that we've now lost sight of, given what's happened. And Reagan comes to Moscow, he speaks at Moscow State University, all the things that he does, and there's an ad up in the British Embassy and every institute looking for translators, and they want people who can speak English. I think I could speak English. So, I kind of go down, and they're paying $100 a day, and I'm thinking, $100 a day? Well, it still sounds like a lot, actually. And I think, my God, I could fund my entire next year at St Andrews. I think of the things I could do with $100 a day. How long, many days is this? It's amazing, I'm going to go down there. And of course, I start speaking to them and saying, "Are you speaking English?" And I say, "God, your accent, where's that from?" But then they're kind of intrigued by it. And they said, "But yeah, well, maybe we've got a job for you. Tom Brokaw needs his hair spraying." And I'm like, "Oh." It doesn't take much English to do that. Can you handle that kind of hairspray? And I said, can I? Yeah, I've got spiky hair at the time, lots of hairspray there. So I think, yeah, I can do that. And they said, make coffee, and then you can run around with the Russian, camera crews, because my Russian was actually pretty good at this point. So I thought, okay, that's the job, $100 a day for doing that, I can do that. And so I'm doing a lot of spraying Tom Brokaw's hair on the top of the Russia Hotel. It's actually pretty thickly, I don't know if you remember Tom Brokaw and his hair. It didn't look like he needed much spraying, but he's worried about every one wisp. And you go, "Where's the girl with the hairspray?" And I'd be, "All right, Tom," like this, standing there with on the ready. And I can even remember what kind of hairspray it was. It was a Weller, as well. So it was a pink, great big, huge pink thing. I used a lot of it. And then I got asked to go and make a coffee for Maria Shriver, and I thought, I can do that. But of course, all the coffee I'd ever made was from a Nescafe thing. You put in a spoon and stir it. And there's this contraption. It's, of course, a drip coffee machine, as I now know. And I looked at it and I thought, what's this? What's this paper thing? And it's got such a filter. And where do you put the water? And what? So I'm pouring things in all the wrong places. I don't put the filter in because I don't know what it is. And I've got coffee everywhere. There's a nasty burning smell, and I've scalded myself. And I'm covered in coffee dregs. I'm thinking, this isn't working. Oh, God, I'm starting to sweat a bit. And suddenly a man comes in, who I did not know was then Professor Robert Legvold from Columbia. Somebody who might have heard of him. I had no idea who he was. He turned out to be a friend of Tom Brokaw's from school, and he'd been invited along for the ride, but to give advice. And he said, "What are you doing?" And immediately shows me, what to do. And he can't understand why, I said, "Look, I'm British. I only know how to make tea." And so, "Okay, then, this is what you do. This is a filter." I'm like, "Okay." And then he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Well, British student. I saw the ad for $100 a day. Make coffee. Somebody, "You can't really make coffee. Are you studying? Obviously, you're studying Russian." I said, "Yes." And he said, "What are you going to do next?" I said, "I have no idea." And he said, "The scholarships, the United States, and you can learn to make more than coffee." And I said, "Well, how do you do that?" And he said, "Go to the embassy and ask to talk to the cultural attaché, and they'll, connect you." So it turns out the cultural attaché, a guy called Michael Bird, who worked for the British Council, it was his first posting in Russia, and he just had a scholarship to Harvard University in the Russian Research Center. He'd just come from there, and he said, "I can help you apply." And I was like, wow. All because I didn't know how to make a cup of coffee. So, just sometimes when you're struggling and somebody comes over and says, "How can I help you?" just ask them some questions about who they are. Maybe if you need funding for your project or something like that, you never know who they are. And it took me years to figure out that it was him. And it was because obviously it was such a blur. And years later, he becomes a professional colleague. And I'm telling that story. He said, "That was me." And he said, "I don't really remember that, but I do remember some inept British person." I was like,
And was it through Maria Shriver then that you met Arnold Schwarzenegger?
I was supposed to be making coffee for Maria Shriver. Yeah.
And you met Arnold Schwarzenegger?
I didn't meet him, but of course I didn't know she was a Kennedy, but I knew she was married to Arnold Schwarzenegger. So that's kind of, obviously I'd been under a bit of a rock on one part, but Arnold Schwarzenegger by that point was already, kind of pretty famous as a bodybuilder. So. Mm-hmm.
But you've put him forward to be the ambassador to Ukraine.
To Russia, actually, a long while ago, yeah. This was, this kind of came out in the news recently, and it was kind of a little amusing. After this amazing video he made, making appeals to the Russians. But back in, before everything transpired, but when already the relationship between the United States and Russia were becoming quite antagonistic. And Michael McFaul, who many of you know had been the ambassador then, had a really rough time because the Russians were pretty much had him in their crosshairs and were going after him. I was thinking to myself, who would be somebody that the Russians wouldn't mess with? And I ran through all of the list of candidates, and I thought, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Because the Russians at the time, and particularly Putin, were pretty obsessed with celebrity. And, we know Steven Seagal and Gérard Depardieu, and I'd once seen Mickey Rourke coming out of a hotel in looking quite worse for wear, it had to be said, which I think he mostly looked like anyway. But anyway, I thought, God, that's Mickey Rourke. What's he doing here? And it turned out that he was on a kind of a trip that fans of his in Russia had organised. And Putin's was in the time into taking off his shirt and doing a lot of the bodybuilding, and speaks very good German. Arnold Schwarzenegger, of course, native German speaker. They've got this, as it came out in the video, this shared history of the siege of Leningrad, with Arnold Schwarzenegger's father being on the Nazi German side of the whole affair, and of course Putin's family being caught up in the siege itself, which of course makes it a horrible irony when you think of everything that's happening now in Mariupol and everywhere else as well. And also Arnold Schwarzenegger is an open book. There's not much you can scandalise him with or exploit him, and in fact, I thought I just had these fantasies of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Putin walking about together, speaking in German, doing bodybuilding, and it's just he's also governor of California, very smart guy, somebody who's well recognised everywhere, and maybe he could have turned the trajectory. I still think there was something in it, but when I pitched it to some of my colleagues at the time in the Obama administration and the sea, they thought I was barking mad. So. Anyway, I did talk it up for a while, and I still wonder. I mean, not that I would think it would have changed the whole trajectory, but there was something at that point, back in 2013 or so, where maybe we could have pushed things in a slightly different direction. And the Russians were always complaining that they thought they were not fully respected, and that would, I think, have been in a odd way, I suppose, for most people thinking about that, a real sign of respect. And Arnold Schwarzenegger himself, as I think he's made very clear, the video he made after January 6th in the United States, which, even though he wielded the sword of Conan, which I thought was a little odd during that, it actually worked really well. And that recent video that he made I thought was extraordinarily powerful. He clearly knows how to connect with audiences, and he, of course, is ubiquitously recognisable.
I think it's a fantastic idea. Sometimes you have to think outside the box. I mean, if Reagan can become president, why can't Arnold Schwarzenegger become ambassador to Russia? I mean, you say here in this article in the Times, it was David Charter who interviewed you in this article on Tuesday, the 5th of April, that Putin has a very high tolerance for this kind of carnage, what's going on right now, and the loss of personnel. And I think he has this belief, you say, and we'll have to just see if this is tested, that Russians are going to go along with it. He's not going to sue for peace. So whatever we do to formulate the way out of this has to make Putin look, from his point of view, like he's won something. And I think that shows, I mean, it's very Asian. You're basically saying that you don't want him to, allowing him not to lose face. And I think that, Schwarzenegger would, you said they're the same height as well, and that they could, he as a very manly, old-fashioned manly, alpha male type, they could communicate better. And I think that he would have been able to kind of broker some end point for this. What are your thoughts on that? Well,
look, I mean, you're obviously an expert on Asia and Asian cultures and China, and I keep thinking about Sun Tzu and the art of war and the Golden Bridge. I mean, it could be a pretty shabby steel and rusting bridge with a bit of gold paint over it, but kind of that is really the mentality. I mean, in many respects, it explains a lot why Xi and Putin have found kind of a common cause in many respects, and have a kind of a comity, because there's a very similar perspective to things. And Putin, this is, I mean, it's an uncomfortable point to make, as a woman who's an expert in Russia, and there are an awful lot of, high-level women in US politics. Every time that somebody like Madeleine Albright or Condoleezza Rice or Hillary Clinton or all of the other, Victoria Nuland and others would appear in Russia, Putin would think it was done deliberately to diss him. So where people like me would kind of show up there. I mean, not at the the level that often I was interacting with some of the deputy foreign ministry people, but there was always a perception in the Kremlin that we were just trying to mess with them. That this kind of old-fashioned kind of sense. I mean, if you think about the top of Russian politics, I mean, in the Soviet period there were kind of prominent women. Partly it was quotas, but there was kind of a lot more women. Again, there's social mobility. I mean, the most prominent woman in Russian politics has been Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the central bank, who is extraordinarily accomplished, and they give her a lot of credit for technocratic skills. But where are the women in politics, sort of spokeswomen for the Kremlin and for the foreign ministry? But this is a pretty misogynistic society, and just like you were saying in a lot of Asian societies that still have a kind of traditional perspective, it's that kind of appearance of who they're negotiating with. Are they being emasculated? Are they being diminished in some respects? And as I said, I've also thought many times that the way that we translate the Russians is obviously problematic. So our best translators are often women, because they're kind of into the nuance of the language, but the way that they're translating, just the way that they sound, is not conveying the menace or the kind of aggressive intent behind some of the words. And I would try to get that across sometimes to my colleagues, that sometimes, particularly with Trump, who was always just going with the mood music or whatever the translation was, we might have had a kind of aggressive, crude-sounding guy, but had done a better way of conveying what Putin was actually saying to him than, kind of a very accomplished woman who is, kind of, in a way, sort of smoothing out the nuances, kind of in the language. And one of the worst examples of this was actually with President Erdogan of Turkey, where the translators on both sides were women, and they were often alarmed by things he was saying. And you could see in their heads kind of clicking over that they would actually have to make a little adjustment there. Well, so the whole thing was lost in translation. And one of the, because I had all of Europe in my portfolio in the NSC, one of the translators came up to me after and pulled me aside and said, look, you've got to explain to everybody, this was actually dreadful. But I couldn't make myself, kind of translate the crudity of this, because I couldn't figure out in English how to, kind of say these same things, because I just wouldn't say it. And please, can you convey this to National Security Advisor? So this is sometimes a lot of the problems that we, face because of things have got lost in translation somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, darling.
Yeah, I got called darling a few times by Trump, but it's not the first time I've been called that. So.
Yes, I said that on purpose. So there's an anecdote in this book where Trump calls you darling and has you go out and type something up from, because he thinks you're the secretary in the room, not his Russia advisor. So let's take this to Trump a bit. So you have become well known, if not famous, outside policy circles and the corridors of power for your testimony during the first impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump, and and indeed that brief part of your career takes up about a third of this book. I would say, as I said before, though, it is enlightening, and it gives us a door into how chaotic and misogynistic it was. The least interesting, I found it the least interesting part of this book. But I mean, I would have liked to have read more about you. But were you pressured into putting more about Trump into this book? And the legal read must have been extensive.
Actually, the legal read by this point was a lot less than you would think. I won't mention the person I was asked to exclude because they're very litigious. So it's just one person I was asked to take out of the book. It's just a passing reference because we'll just get sued for this one line. Is it really germane to the book? I was like, well, no, not really. It's just kind of an interesting anecdote, and they said, no, we'll take it out. But in terms of Trump is an open book. The public and private person are exactly the same. And, obviously there was a lot of pressure from having been in the Trump administration, like everybody. I mean, there are hundreds of Trump books out there, and, some of them are actually quite interesting, some of them less so, some of them, is again, because he's not that different in public and private. But what I wanted to try to do is explain the phenomenon. Because when I met Trump, I was like, I know this kind of guy. He's like 1980s man, as I say in the book. I mean, for any woman who's sort of sitting over a certain age, you've met this guy over and over again, and you're the kind of person that you would stay away from. Kind of normally you meet him in a bar and you're like, I'm out of here, where's the ladies? Kind of, and sorry, and kind of, nice talking to you, but, I mean, he's the kind of person who just thinks that everybody fancies him, in Northern England, and he's incredibly charismatic, and every issue just needs him. Trump has no ideology except from self-idolatry, and the reason I'm so outspoken and critical about him has got nothing to do with politics. I'm not a partisan person, but it's about just the nature of the person that he is. It was never America first, it was always Trump first. And he was a wannabe autocrat. Some of my colleagues would say, well, he didn't have the discipline to be it, and Ambassador Bolton has said this, kind of many times, and the system worked, but the system didn't work because he helped to rot it from within. And we see people like that in politics all the time, and it needed to be called out. So I put it in that context of populism. This is what you get. This is what you get when grievances build up over time, when people don't feel they have any agency and they're looking for a champion. He was no different from, the world heavyweight boxing champion, kind of saying, I'm going to be there and fight for you. That's why he's always seen at NASCAR races and, kind of wrestling federation, because he's just, he's kind of appealing, kind of thinking with a mass appeal, just saying, you're getting ripped off, I'm going to stick it to the establishment, I'm your guy. And really behind that, there wasn't really any underpinning of any kind of substance. And he hijacked the Republican Party and has undermined the two-party system in the United States, turned, the Republican Party into a sort of charismatic death cult, literally, kind of the politicization of absolutely everything, set the whole kind of agenda for that happening here. And he was, the whole time, the thing about Putin is not that Putin had something on him. I just want to be very clear. We've all got something on Trump. There was Access Hollywood tapes. There was, kind of all women kind of coming out and talking about things that he'd done. Everybody knows that he was grifting on the graft. All of the investigations into his background. We've all got that. Putin just could see that Trump was incredibly vulnerable to flattery, and that it was all about him, and so he could manipulate and play with him, because that's Putin's thing. He finds people's weak spots and he hones in on it. And Trump admired Putin because he thought he was, as he said in Helsinki when he was standing there in that utterly embarrassing press conference, I've got Mr. Putin next to me, Vladimir Putin, and he's strong and powerful. It was all about that. And Putin played on the whole idea that the Russians had interfered in the election. And there was no evidence that they'd changed the outcome of the election in terms of the actual account. But just the fact that they were in there, and Trump knowing that he hadn't really won, kind of the election in the sense of not winning the popular vote, and that he'd won by 70,000 votes from 3 counties and 3 states in the Electoral College. And at the back of his mind, there was obviously that fear. Maybe I didn't. And all these people are kind of playing with it, that if Putin had actually said to him, well, yes, Donald, actually, we did interfere and we did change the vote, his whole mind would have exploded. So in Helsinki and elsewhere, he couldn't possibly entertain that idea and push back on it, because it all fed into his vulnerabilities.
His ego.
And Putin played with that, because that was kind of in a way what he had dangling over him, that uncertainty, the fact that so many people in US domestic politics were thinking that, Trump had been run as an asset by Putin, that he was the Moscow candidate, not the Manchurian candidate. It drove Trump nuts. And he wanted to lash out on anybody who raised that as a question, or the journalists, and kind of others here, anybody who suggested it, and to push back on it, even at the expense of jeopardizing US national security, suggesting that the Ukrainians had intervened, which of course was the substance of all of this. And the whole impeachment was all about Trump withholding a visit for Vladimir Zelensky to the White House, which was incredible, important symbolism, withholding military aid to do a personal favor, for him to win the next round of the election that he still says that he won. So everything became embroiled in domestic politics, and this is the essence, the apogee and the agony of populism. And the personalization of politics, and that's the way that I decided to write about it, rather than writing it as a Trump book. And I felt that coming from the working classes, the blue collar workers that Trump says that he's there trying to protect, I just wanted to say this guy has got, he's trying to sell a lifestyle of the rich and famous. You too can have a gold-plated toilet and a third beautiful wife, potentially from Eastern Europe, to some guy. You can live like that. Or, you women, you can kind of come and work in, my White House, or I'm going to change the whole system for you. But none of it was real. It was all performance. And, people were actually voted for him because they thought that he was actually going to change something. And he didn't.
America is a very aspirational society. I'm American, and we like a man made good or a woman made good. And, I remember speaking to people about, Trump, that I remember his first big false truth, saying that, he came from nothing, I came from nothing, and I'm just like you. And I thought, of course he didn't. But he really, he kept going on and on about that. And of course, and a lot of people, ate that up, and they believed it, despite the fact that he came from, a dynasty, a real estate kind of dynasty. And the other thing about, I said to my best friend, but he's a bankrupt, he's been bankrupted, and, he's got dodgy accounting and blah, blah, blah. And she goes, yes, but, he's got Trump Tower, and, even if it's a house of cards, the people I spoke to, they said, well, yes, but, while he's here, he's living well, and look at me, I'm in a 2-bedroom flat, that I rent. so what, he does dodgy accounting. If I could do it, I would do it too. I mean, so many people.
That was exactly the point. And look, I have a very extended family in the United States. Some from the UK who've moved over, who voted for him, and then in my in-laws. And it was that kind of point. We all want to be our own boss as well. We don't want to be beholden to the man. We want to be able to just sort of say, what we want to say. We're kind of sick of, the elites, who are in the establishment in Washington who are doing this, that, and the other. And part of that is a kind of a misperception. But although I actually have to say it's much more rooted, kind of in the US with regional regional differentiation in class. But in the United States, I mean, again, another reason for writing the book, opportunity and social mobility is broken down. So in the United States, over the last sort of 20, 30 years, you've got less and less chance of moving from, the bottom quintile to the top. Now, in the UK, it was always difficult. But in the United States, it didn't used to be. People had the perception, at least, that they could do a Donald Trump, in the idea that he started from nothing, even though he didn't. But now we've only got a 5% chance in the United States of going from, the bottom quintile to the top, which sounds much more like the UK, where, that's been, kind of more the norm, in times past. And Americans don't get that. And they're seeing, and all there's the whole swirl of identity politics and, people kind of looking for people in certain positions because they're a woman or they're from, different identity. Most people are not seeing that they could do this. And just because you had a black president or just because, you have this person there doesn't mean for them that they can follow that pathway. They still think that the system is blocking them, which is actually true. And there's huge regional differences. Just like here in the UK, it's not that often to see people from the northeast in any kind of prominent position, unless they're Ant and Dec, as I keep getting pointed out as comedians. But, they're not there, evident on, the higher levels of politics and things in a meaningful way. In the United States, it's very difficult now to see people from the Rust Belt. And they don't see themselves. Now, in actual fact, behind the scenes, and I've got a whole section about this in the book, they are there. But, when the president, like Trump, takes credit for everything, you don't see, the guy from the Pennsylvania coal country who might have become the deputy treasury person who's actually done all of this job because they're not allowed to go out there and speak about what they did. And that's one of the reasons why in the impeachment public trial, all of us had an opening statement saying who we were. Because I worked with people from across the US government, many of whom had gone in the military. The US military is a great, kind of social mobility ladder, who had come from every imaginable background and were the first people in their family to go to college or to get this kind of training. And they were the real, people, but nobody knew they were actually there. And so there was this perception that the United States government was filled with, as Trump would say, these kind of, I must have Putin there, bow tie wearing, kind of Yale, Princeton, Harvard grads who, would just had been there since the 1920s and that there was no change. But that wasn't the case.
Actually, I went to university on the GI Bill.
Exactly, in the Pell Grants, that's exactly what enough people did. I mean, people from our generation really had a lot of opportunity, and those opportunities have started to disappear.
Now, back to Putin and his sort of interference in US politics. At one point, you write that Putin realized that, with Trump in power, he didn't have to interfere, that the States was, he could just sit back and watch it, implode upon itself. So Adam Entos, there's a great interview or article about Fiona in the New Yorker. She's interviewed by Adam Entos. I don't know how to say his surname. Entos. He writes, it talks a little bit about your, before you took up the position at the White House, the pros and cons of it. I mean, you must have weighed that very heavily. And he says you did weigh up the pros and cons, and you had some people saying, no, Fiona, you can't, you'll be a fall guy or a fall woman, fall girl, and some people were saying, well, you must do it, and you latterly in the book you confessed that you felt a bit naive, but you wanted to give back. You felt it was your kind of duty, and I don't disagree with you. But did you feel out of control when you were there? I mean, you went in with all these high aims, and then you just saw it. How did you feel when you were there?
There's this one of my favorite aphorisms from Viktor Chernomyrdin, who might have actually ended up being Prime Minister of Russia, and I think we'd be on a different track because he had a very different relationship with Ukraine than Vladimir Putin clearly has. And he always said, we hope for the best, but it turned out as usual. And that was kind of like the mantra, kind of for the 1990s in Russia. And, that's, I did hope for the best, and it turned out as usual. And I was very naive about US politics, actually. And I'll admit it. And, I did have people saying, look, I'll never speak to you again if you do this. You know what Trump's about. Of course I did. But I actually knew an awful lot of people who were still in the government. Lots of people got detailed around. I'd been in the government before as a national intelligence officer under George W. Bush and under Barack Obama. And, I wasn't going there for the perks of the job by any means. And I was going there because I was really worried about what the Russians had done and the domestic political fallout from that. The whole intelligence community was, on the outs with Trump because of, the infamous dossier. And, I did not believe that Trump was the Moscow candidate. I believed that he was incredibly flawed and had been manipulated. And it was obvious to me that Americans had voted Trump in, even with the vagaries of the Electoral College. I mean, it's a pretty arcane and crazy system, but it had happened before, right, with Bush and Gore. It's just that, that was in Florida with that kind of margin, and the Russians hadn't interfered in a meaningful way there. And then everybody saw the Russian interference. They couldn't explain what had happened, but if you lived in the old Rust Belt, you could explain it. The people that I talked to voted for Trump because they thought the Democrats had abandoned them, which is the same reason why members of my family voted for the Tories and voted for Brexit up in the old Red Wall districts for the first times in 100 years, electing a Tory candidate because they thought Labour didn't care. And they just sent up a carpetbagger who was looking to be foreign something or other or defend something and didn't kind of really care about them. And so, I kind of thought, well, okay, I've got that picture. We've got to do something about what the Russians are doing. There's a lot of people in here I've worked with before from the National Intelligence Council and other things. And surely people will realise the national security depth of this and the risks. Well, that surely was the idiocy, but because I got in there and found that politics was just as dirty as the Kremlin. In fact, I knew the Kremlin better. I didn't know who some of these cast of characters were. Or I thought that, when Rudy Giuliani popped up, I thought, well, wasn't he the mayor, of New York, and he was this prosecutor? Surely he can't be, so that was okay. And so I felt, I had to go home and Google everybody and kind of figure out what they were doing. And I mean, I was, my job was to keep track of the Russians or the Turks or the Ukrainians and the French and the Germans and we Brits, kind of as a weird one, kind of often, kind of having UK in the portfolio as well. And the biggest problem was all of this coterie of people around Trump and the fact that Trump was paying more attention to what was going on in Fox News. I discovered that, many of my senior colleagues, when they wanted to advise Trump of something, they'd get on the Sunday shows and they would go on Fox News or CNN to basically say the things to him that he wouldn't listen to in the Oval Office. So it wasn't like he didn't listen to me, he didn't listen to anybody. And anybody who became Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, he also thought was a secretary. I mean, I most definitely looked like one taking notes, that was my job. But even, Rex Tillerson, CEO of ExxonMobil, when he becomes Secretary Tillerson, he's just staff. And, you saw about the dismissive way in which Trump dealt with people. The first National Security Advisor, General McMaster, was an all-American hero, just an incredible person. Trump just treated him and, Bolton, all like dirt when, they kind of came in. And so it was just this whole dismissive quality. And then it was just this cast of extraordinarily strange characters who would, get in My Pillow guy, all of the people that we're reading about. I still can't remember I know he has a name. But, I just keep thinking, really? And you'd cross the road, West Executive, from the NSC building in the old Executive Office building to the West Wing, and you'd see the strangest people. I once saw John Voight getting out of a car wearing a cowboy hat and looking just like he, was from, Midnight Cowboy almost, and just a lot older. And I thought, what's he doing here? Is he coming in to give advice? Kim Kardashian. People like this, but hopefully he was not giving advice on Turkey just during the kind of Armenia-Turkish things. That, oh my God, she's probably going to be special envoy to Armenia and I'm going to have to deal with this. What do I do? Kind of, how is this going to work out? I mean, it was just this level of absurdity. One of my colleagues got a call from Sylvester Stallone because he'd been in Bulgaria and was passing on a message from the Bulgarian president. And he's saying, he's just looking like this the whole time he's talking. He's got patched in through the White House switchboard. And actually it was probably a very sensible conversation, but it was just absurd. And look, things like this happen here as well, right? I mean, we know all about that, and I think there's quite a lot going on at the moment here in UK politics. But it just underscored how difficult it was to deal with this. And this is why we are in a mess right now. This is why Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, because he thought we were absolutely all over the place. It's not one single thing. It's not just NATO. It's not this and that. It's just because he thought that we had lost the plot. And we'd lost the plot a long time ago, and he could do whatever the heck he liked because we were just a bunch of idiots. And he'd exploited and stirred everything up in 2016, and we'd continued to be oblivious. And, we were all kind of running around being very high on ourselves, full of it. And, we were just gone from the scene, and he could just move in.
I was just, I interviewed a few months ago Michael Sheridan, who wrote this fantastic book about Hong Kong and the Chinese, their long-standing plans to get it back and what they were going to do with it afterwards. And I mean, this was, 50, 60 years in the making. I know Isabel Hilton is here and she can talk on that more informed than I can. But the thing with Putin and Ukraine, I mean, as you said earlier upstairs, that this, he had this in mind for a long time, and he was just waiting patiently for the moment to strike. Can I just ask? I mean, is this 11:30 that we're finishing this?
I think we're supposed to take some questions.
I want to take some questions, as well, because I want to open the floor now. Shall we use this opportunity to open the floor?
But I think, that point that you've made, I mean, is probably relevant to some of the questions about, the way that Putin, if we don't do something, paves the way, for Xi and others to kind of see that, maybe they could do, something similar. I think that really is a risk.
Like that?
Yeah.
Hi, sorry.
Oh, hello. I'm sorry. Behind the pole.
Thank you. Anyway, I've got a booming voice. I've just recently seen a rather horrifying play by Mike Wagner called 40 Seconds, which is all about how Trump comes back and fights the election with Kamala Harris. And it's a kind of frighteningly believable plot, a little bit crazy but believable. And I just wondered, really, watching it, when I got home, I kind of felt like I needed to have a shower to get rid of Trump. But really, can America ever really recover from Trump, no matter what happens, whether he runs again? Will America recover from Trump?
Probably not, actually. I mean, a lot of the people that I worked with, and Ambassador Bolton, some of his recent comments, and in his book, The Room Where It Happened, think that the institutions really held up. I don't actually think so, and I think that what we saw in terms of Congress and the blows to the Republican Party, I don't think that they can recover from that. I mean, it's a real party. I'm not a partisan person, just to be very clear, but I worked with all the people from the George W. Bush administration. Many of the people who came in to staff the Trump administration came, right out of previously out the Bush administration, from out of the Republican, party apparatus, perfectly sensible, very accomplished people. They were shocked. Some of them said they'll never enter public service again, after that experience. And he's captured the party. He's made it impossible, kind of for members of Congress to kind of push back. We've seen the impact on state politics at the federal state level, the way that there's a kind of a style of Trumpism. I myself was a little incredulous that there was a thing, Trumpism, because I saw that he didn't have any ideology, but people are right about the style and the approach. He's kind of, got a lot of emulators in other places as well, that kind of, see how you can capture a polity. I wrote a piece in Politico just a few days after the January 6th, because I saw it as a self-coup. It's the kind of thing, I'd studied for years and seen in other places. The kind of thing we'd been pushing back against in Venezuela with Nicolas Maduro staying in power, and he was Trump, doing exactly the same thing and manipulating the media, using Twitter and Facebook, and as a kind of the megaphone, like the equivalent in a coup where you take over the post office and the telegraph, and capturing the Congress in the sense of capturing the Republican Party. And the fact that still, 20-odd million people, maybe more, think he won the election and that this was stolen, the undermining of confidence in the electoral system. I mean, this is something that is what Vladimir Putin wanted to do in 2016. He wanted everyone to believe that the Russians had stolen the election and that Americans hadn't voted for their president. Because he wanted us to lose faith as the United States and Brits and others, kind of when you think about Brexit or the Scottish independence referendum. He wants us all to think that Russia is all-powerful and, can manipulate all of the politics, because this, obviously puffs him up and, gives kind of Russia a larger sense. But it was Trump who undermined the 2020 election. I mean, my colleague Christopher Krebs, who was the head of the Centre for Electoral Security, had to speak out against his own president. He kept having to point out to people that Vladimir Putin couldn't steal the election, but Donald Trump could. And that was exactly, kind of what was happening. So, we have the January 6th committee, and it's very important that they, get some traction, with what they're doing, but it's also going to be very hard. And this is, you were referencing before, this is a wake-up call for liberal democracy. It's a wake-up call for all of us, who care about the societies in which we operate, because this is what I say in the book, the ghost of Christmas future is Vladimir Putin in Russia, and a country where people have no idea really what's happening, and they have, it seems, no agency to push back.
Am I choosing the next person who's going to ask a question, or are you guys doing it for us?
Yep.
Rosie's doing it at the back.
Thank you. Given the dangers of nuclear weapons united both Reagan and Gorbachev, especially the work in the 80s on nuclear winter, given the fact that a Russia-NATO war could go nuclear and could be catastrophic, what thoughts do you have on a diplomatic off-ramp that could be provided for Putin and how that could be achieved?
Well, first of all, Putin wants us to think that we have to hand him Ukraine on a plate because we're all terrified about nuclear weapons. And there is a big difference between now and the 1980s in that there was much more checks and balances in the Russian system. People like Putin were in the dark corridors of power, and there was a Politburo, and there was a whole Communist Party and a whole system. And, the Soviet Union didn't actually engage in that kind of nuclear blackmail. Although they actually had a full arsenal that Russia still has of strategic and intermediate and tactical nuclear weapons and biological and chemical weapons that was part of their doctrine to use. It was only in extreme circumstances, and we managed to keep the strategic balance. Vladimir Putin is doing this deliberately, and kind of he's already using nuclear weapons rhetorically in a way that the Soviet Union never did before, but in the way that Kim Jong-un and Iranians and others have tried to use in terms of blackmail. So one of the things is, it's not an off-ramp. He wants us to take an off-ramp. So our diplomacy actually has to be to get out there and to basically say to everybody else, this is just impermissible, because what he is doing is opening up a huge arms race across the board. I mean, if you're sitting somewhere else, you're thinking, wow, Ukraine's getting all of this because they gave up the strategic nuclear arsenal along with Belarus and Kazakhstan that they inherited in the 1990s from the collapse of the Soviet Union. What idiots were they? And, you think about China, you're mentioning, and what's happened in Hong Kong and all the menace against Taiwan. And if you're Japan and you're South Korea, you're thinking, I'm not sure the United States is going to come and help me. Look what's happening to Ukraine. I want a nuclear weapon. And, we know Israel and, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, because you've got Pakistan and India. This now, the whole non-proliferation regime is out the window. So the diplomacy has to be really focused on that. We were supposed to be having a review of the non-proliferation treaty this August. I mean, I think it will be, very difficult to do that again. But, basically, Putin has already gone into that impermissible territory without even using it, by even saying things like this. Because he's making it very clear that the only way you get your way is to be a nuclear power. Because, of course, all journalists, say, well, of course, we're not doing this, are we? Because of Russia being a nuclear power, and of course they're right. That's it. I mean, he's getting away literally with murder because he has nuclear weapons. And he is contemplating, to get us to back off. Because, again, it's not about his off-ramp, it's about our off-ramp. Our, basically suing for peace, not his, because he wants to declare victory, using a tactical battlefield nuke in somewhere. Already talking about, well, I could position, nuclear Iskanders in Kaliningrad. They've already got them there. I mean, this is just playing with all of our minds. It's a big mind game. But yes, he would, try to use it, which is why we have to push back. We have to get everybody to realise what a nightmare this is for the strategic balance everywhere in the world now. Because, I mean, if I'm the leader of any country, I want a nuclear weapon after this, and then how are we going to be negotiating with the Iranians? And what are we going to do with Kim Jong-un? So that's kind of, I think it's actually the right question, and he wants us to come up with a conclusion that's basically selling off Ukraine to him, because it then, kind of underscores that might makes right, and nuclear might definitely makes right.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Descending right down to the tactical and where you began your talk, Fiona, Donbass.
Yeah.
What happens now? And why has the Russian army, is this a surprise to Putin, performed so badly? And with that, do you think Europe, particularly Germany, Italy, will be weak over trading Donbass, not show resolve? Is it now the focus of where we are? And if it goes the wrong way, could we be in for a very long war?
Yeah, and getting back to the point about, kind of the use of, a nuclear weapon to kind of push on this. Look, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at this. There's some very smart Russian military analysts who have said that what they think Putin was thinking that he was doing, there's lots of Twitter threads, some of you have probably followed them, I find some of them really quite fascinating. Camille Gareev and others, I think they've really captured it. That Putin was kind of thinking about this in the way that the Soviet Union thought about Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Poland in the 1980s, where they did a kind of self under General Jaruzelski about kind of heading off the Red Army coming in and kind of self-modification, self-coup. And he thought that he could just get in there in the same way, with the same kind of level of violence we saw in 56 and 68, which was pretty significant, but that topple the governments. And that, put in a replacement, and the rest of us would all, kind of get involved in figuring out, some kind of accommodation. And, making the demands very clear. A recognition of the annexation of Crimea being part of Russia, recognition of the independence of the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk within the full administrative borders, and possibly then the annexation of those areas to Russia, because it looks like they're paving the way for that as well. And then, a dismembered Ukraine and, kind of a recognition of whatever puppet government has been put in there and figuring out that with the menace of nuclear weapons and all the other kinds of things happening, that's what would happen. Now, of course, that hasn't happened. And, instead, kind of he's trying to sort of declare a victory. I was personally somewhat surprised that they decided to go full on with the invasion of Ukraine, with Kiev as well, rather than, just kind of coming up from the south and the east. But it was, I think, in part to ensure they had something. If you think about a lot of these conflicts, people kind of overplay to make sure that they get something that they absolutely want. And it's clear that that's what he wants. But I think it's also that he would really like to have the whole of the Sea of Azov. That's, the destruction of Mariupol is part of this. It doesn't matter if it's all in rubble. It's that acquisition and teaching us a lesson as well as the Ukrainians and punishing them severely for not being Russians and, for standing up to him. And hopefully, taking from, this is from his perspective, not from mine or ours, control, or at least, kind of being able to exert control of the whole of the Ukrainian Black Seaboard down to Odessa and further. Because that was what they were headed for in 2014, with the whole idea of Novorossiya, New Russia. And it didn't work. He tried to do it by stirring up trouble in the same way that they had in Donbass. And again, going back to the way that the history of Donbass, the old Rust Belt, the place that had lost its direction. It was easier to stir things up there than it turned out to be in Kherson and Odessa and others in 2014, so he sparked something off. And obviously they'd done their homework on Crimea and, played that one right. But the big, kind of problem is obviously the Ukrainians are not doing anything that he wants to see happen. So this is going to be a horrible, bloody grind. And this gets back to, the quote that you made. He's got a very high tolerance for horror, including for the death of Russian soldiers. If it really is true that Russia's lost more men than they did in Afghanistan and then in Chechnya, this is shocking. But again, we're hearing a lot of its conscripts, or soldiers from the North Caucasus, they're bringing up mercenaries, people from other fights. He must be concerned about, significantly geographically concentrated losses, but he thinks that he's, crushed Memorial, the main human rights watchdog group, or the soldiers' mothers kind of committees. He's banking on the propaganda, and he's banking on the demonization of Ukraine and also on the West of, kind of prevailing here, and the fact that Russians will in fact believe that the West is out to get them. So the propaganda is extraordinarily important. Now, we've got to push back against this. It gets back to, the question you're asking about we've got a lot of diplomacy to do here. Because Putin has quite successfully convinced everyone that this is all about NATO, this is a proxy war, this is all East-West, and, if you're in Africa or Asia, you kind of, go along with that. But this is a post-colonial land grab. Ukraine is no different, from many of the other countries who've sort of sided or sat it out from Russia, because he's very successfully made it all about Russia and the United States. And there is elements about that as well. I mean, he does want to push the United States out of Europe. He doesn't want to have NATO there, but he does want to get hold of Ukraine. So there's multiple things he was always playing at once, but actually we've now got to the core essence of it, that this is about Ukraine, this is subjugating Ukraine, this is reducing Ukraine to rubble and making it very clear to everyone in the neighbourhood, and us as well, that Russia dominates Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who worked in Ukraine just after the Orange Revolution for some years, and then immediately after the Maidan. I can assure everybody in this room that Dr. Hill's comments about thought we were all over the place and had lost the plot goes back a long way. The book I've got in my hand, the fictional book, or if it is fiction, was written in 2011, and it's about the little green men in Crimea, and indeed Odessa. My question is, and also I would say Wagner should have been picked up many, many years ago. My question for you is, you've had to work hard, you've had to strive. Do you think that there was a strong element of complacency on both sides of the Atlantic regarding Putinism, but that part of it was down to too many people in the corridors of power had perhaps had it too easy? Some of them had a sense of entitlement, and a lot of it was, what's in it for me? So why should I bother? Thank you.
Look, I think you have a point there, and that's kind of Putin's assessment, actually, of the West. He thinks we're soft. He doesn't realise that behind the scenes there's an awful lot of people, like yourself and others, who might have a bit more of a backbone and steel. He didn't necessarily see this on the surface. And I mean, that's why Trump was so exploitable, because in essence he is soft. I mean, he'll hate that, and he's always kind of saying something about me anyway, but I don't care, because that's the essence of it. And Putin is always looking out for vulnerability, and that's why when he rose to become president, you'll all remember, he had that book, that kind of semi-autographical book in the first person, where he tells all these stories about his hard-scrabble background, the things that have become myths, the cornered rat, the kind of the kid from the courtyard, from the communal flat, the kid who always got into a fight, the scrappy fighter, because he wants to give everybody the sense that he is unbelievably hard and ruthless, and that he can always prevail. And we see he makes mistakes. He makes a lot of them, but then he always thinks that, well, if I made mistakes, I'm going to compensate for it by coming down even harder. And that's the kind of the risk that we have right now, because he can't afford to fail, and he's looking for any chink of weakness, basically on our part, and that gets the fact that we really have to have resolve here. And we look, the Ukrainians have proved that they have. Look at Zelensky. That is just incredible, the way that he has stepped up to the occasion. And I'm sure that Putin thought, the guy's a comedian, he's had his own show, he's got nothing. But Zelensky has proven, like many Ukrainians, that he's got a lot of spine and resilience, himself. He never had it easy. Imagine being, a Russian-speaking Jew in Ukraine with a history of, loss in the Holocaust, and going back to the history of the Pale of Settlement and the pogroms, and the fact that his family have always stayed there. Zelensky's obviously made of sterner stuff, and that's the Ukrainians. I mean, as you know from working there, it's a very horizontal networked society. I think there was a piece in The Economist, recently about the same thing. They're not the subjects of their ruler. They're the guys from the borderlands, the literal borderlands, who ran away from the hierarchical, centralized power because they wanted to do their own thing. They've had, empires come and go. They're kind of still there, and they're just going to keep on fighting. And there's a lesson in that for all of us here as well, that we all have agency. This whole idea of, just kind of relinquishing everything, to one person to make decisions for us. I mean, look what's happened to the Russians. There's a colleague of mine, Lucian Kim, who was the former bureau chief to National Public Radio in Moscow, had this great quote in a blog piece he wrote for the Kennan Institute, where he said, "The Ukrainians are citizens of their own country, the Russians remain the subjects of their ruler." I've been infantilized by the kind of paternalism that's there. And this gets back to, when I'm thinking about, the Durham Miners Association, the communities I grew up, they did things for themselves. They didn't want to live off the state. But in Russia, the state dominates. 60% of the Russian workforce is dependent on the state, which is another reason why people are rallying around Putin. Because if he fails, they fail too. Because the state revenues have funding, people who work in the bureaucracy, still huge bureaucracy, working in the state sector. And so there's a lot of people vested in this continuing, and that's why they don't want to know, and they're not pushing back. It takes unbelievable bravery in the Russian context to do something. Alexei Navalny, the bravest person we could possibly think of. He gets poisoned. He somehow miraculously survives by all kinds of luck, and he goes right back to face it and to go into jail. I mean, that is just... which one of us here could imagine doing that? And he's basically trying to say to the Russian people, they say, why did he do it? What a huge mistake. He's just trying to say, look, if I can do it, you can do it. But unfortunately, an awful lot of people are thinking, well, I can't do that. And there's, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Russians who've gone somewhere else because they can't do that. And the people who are staying there from Memorial, we wonder about the Soldiers' Mothers Committee, they're facing, the same kind of fate. So it's incredibly difficult. But look, if Ukraine can fight back, even at huge loss, some Finns that I was in a meeting with in DC on the eve of this, when it looked like it was obvious this was going to happen, said the Ukrainians, look, you've got to fight. It's the only way that the Russians will respect you. It's the only way to push them back. We did that in 1941. We lost all of Karelia, and we lost an awful lot. And, we had to play it carefully during the Cold War, but we prevailed. And, you're going to have to do the same. And, the Ukrainians gulped. But, that's it's the only thing, unfortunately, that Putin respects. There's people pushing back, and he thinks you're weak and you're soft. And look, we gave him every signal that he could get away with this. As you said, it goes back years.
I think he's got everything to lose, which makes him a very, very dangerous man right now. And if he loses, as you say, with this patriarchal society, then then the Russians who have faith in him, they lose as well. They lose a sense of their identity and etc. They have so much vested in him that if he should lose, then who are they then at the end of it, right?
And we've got to bear that in mind, right? Because we don't want to keep having repetitions of this. We're talking about rebuilding Ukraine, reparations. We all remember Germany, from World War I and World War II. We've got to have a short, medium and longer term perspective. This is his war. He decided this. We're pretty confident, we at large have analysed this, that it was made with a handful of people, this decision. They obviously didn't tell the generals and, most of the army. He certainly didn't tell Elvira Nabiul, the central bank. Otherwise, why would you have left half of the central bank assets somewhere else? It's clearly that this was made by a very tiny clique of people. So we have to kind of think, irrespective of what I've just said there, this is a great country, great culture, great people, a lot of potential. We've tried, over and over again to improve the relationship. We've made lots of mistakes. But we have to think down the line about how we, bring Russia itself back into the fold where, it ought to be. Because we're also then, again, making it much more difficult about how we're going to be able to deal over the longer time with China and, with the rest of the world that's watching this very closely. There's one thing about what happens with Putin and the Kremlin, and then there's another much longer term thing about what happens with Russia, not just about Ukraine and the rest of the neighbourhood. And it's going to be very difficult to figure out.
Pan, how much more time do we have? One more question, and can we have? Okay, I'm just. Can we have a? Go on.
I'll try to. If I've got some books at the end. People come up and ask me a kind of a question as well, because I can see there's quite a few people wanted to, and I'd be eager to answer, because I always learn a lot from the questions. Actually, just like it's kind of thought provoking. Like your question about. I started to kind of think about that. About the way that you frame the question is actually spot on, and it's just. But Putin wants us to go off in these different directions, and we have to. Think of ourselves about, what is he doing with all of this? How do we address this? There's so many more questions that often flow from, the things that you think about.
I'd say that this audience is 40% women, and we've had one question from a woman here, so we want to have more representation. Please go.
Hi, my name is Nicholas. I'm from Georgia.
Oh, you're from Georgia? Yeah.
He's already had.
And then we can give you the mic.
already had the mic, so
and then we'll give you the mic as well. No, please go ahead, Nicholas. Yeah, from Georgia. Yeah.
Yeah,
because Georgia, of course, experienced this at first hand in 2008 and was written off, the invasion.
It's a related question. Basically, my country is occupied by Russia,
Absolutely.
20%, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. And I would like to ask you, if you see any similarity, same invasion what happened in 2008, similarity with Ukraine. And also, I listened to one of your interviews, it makes headlines in Georgia. First, United States thought, it was related between Saakashvili and Putin's, political thing, and thought, it was provoked or something like this. But now we can see, Zelensky tried to avoid war, but we could not do anything. It still happened, And second question is, how do you see, Saakashvili's imprisonment, in Georgia, and how think, he have fair court in Georgia, and a public defender talk about, torture, and he has medical issues, and your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a very important point about Georgia, because it gets back to the fact that we kind of facilitated, what happened now too. Because back in 2008, when I was at the National Intelligence Council, we were pretty convinced that the Russians would go into Ukraine as well as Georgia. But, as you were suggesting, Nicholas, people wrote off the whole Georgia invasion as being all about personal things with Saakashvili, because Putin talked famously about wanting to hang Saakashvili up by his balls. I mean, I'm sure Putin is thrilled that Saakashvili is now in jail in Georgia. This is the perfect outcome for him. He did personalize it, but it was really all about teaching Georgia a lesson for wanting to have NATO membership, and also just generally wanting to have an independent country that was out of the orbit of Russia and chart its own course. Because what he did in Georgia was supposed to be a message for everyone else to see what you get. And I mean, as you were probably well aware, Putin told senior Georgian leaders, and I heard this at first hand from them, look, your Western partners promised you a lot, they didn't deliver. I threatened, I delivered. Because, the membership action plan at NATO wasn't going to happen. My view is it shouldn't have been put on the table in Bucharest because we couldn't make it happen. And asking for something you can't have happen is also a sign of weakness. And also, we hadn't thought through what we would do if the Russians invaded Georgia and Ukraine, which became evident in 2008. Now, Georgia was spared from some of the things Ukraine has experienced because the war was quick, because Sarkozy, the president of France at the time, literally got on the first plane from Paris, swept in, and immediately on the back of a napkin writes up a peace treaty, which Georgia is still dealing with the consequences of. And this is, how it's extraordinarily important that Saakashvili is treated within a fair way, because otherwise it looks like Putin's revenge. And it reflects extraordinarily badly on Georgia, because Putin had Saakashvili in his crosshairs as the symbol of Georgia, but he was the symbol of Georgia. Saakashvili made a lot of mistakes, but it was because he was the Western face of a Georgia that wanted to go off in a different direction. He wanted to teach him a lesson, just as he wanted to teach Zelensky the same lesson. So we should have been much more mindful of what was going on in 2008. We missed it completely. And as you said, after that, everybody tried to avoid this. Yushchenko pulled back in Ukraine. Yushchenko at the time, the president, from NATO membership action plan. Yanukovych after that, was very kind of, trying to get into Putin's good graces, signs the extended lease of the Black Sea for the Russian Black Sea fleet. Zelensky, as you said, does everything to try to say he's coming in to improve the relationship, and they all just get literally whacked. And that is just, as you're saying, the message was loud and clear in 2008, it was just misinterpreted. And I think willfully, because people didn't want to deal with it.
Last
one more question.
Yes, yeah.
Marvelous. Tina Fordham, fellow...
yes, I was recognising you, actually. I think I haven't seen you a long time.
Yes. I work in financial markets, which were another kind of actor, which were incredibly complacent in reaction to 2008, 2014, and I, in vain, tried to explain that this was all a big deal. But what I want to ask you about is actually the risk of Russia as a failed state. Certainly the most sanctioned country now in history. I advise companies which are not going to go back and work in Russia as long as Putin's in power. I don't believe, as a fellow political scientist, that we're going to see a coup in Russia unless it's a palace coup. But how much of a risk is it that Putin has overreached and perhaps doesn't get punished by the people, but ends up presiding over a big North Korea with nukes?
Yeah, that was kind of one of the quotes, I think, from some article I read today as well. Look, there's a real risk of that. And I think it's something, when I mentioned about having the short, medium, long-term perspective, that we have to be very mindful of. Look, we know that when we've imposed sanctions, over and over again, Paul's from South Africa, there's a lot of debate about whether the sanctions, were really, the instrumental factor there. But if we look at Iran and North Korea and Cuba and, all the other kind of places, they haven't, Venezuela, they've often, really beggared the country, but they haven't changed the mindset of the people there, because this is kind of the pattern break that, kind of explains about what they see as important. Putin is perfectly happy to preside over the rubble. Look at Bashar al-Assad. We said that Assad must go, and Assad is still there, and his whole country's in ruin, but he's doing fine, and the people around him, fine. But the people of Syria are not doing fine. But this wasn't about them, it was about him and his wife and, all of kind of his family and his hangers-on. And with the Russian system, they said there's about 60% of people who are dependent on the state. So that is a very large, system that's dependent on all of this, and the sources of growth are going to be gone. They were already fading. There was already, kind of a lot of people questioning whether they wanted to be in Russia for all kinds of different reasons without all of this. And, it may not be like in the Bolshevik Revolution where, investors lost their shirts, but then they came back in later because there was so much money to be made. There's a lot of money to be made in other places, and there's a lot of concerns that people have about, development in other places. So I suspect a lot of people will not go back to Russia. And if the Germans are really serious in moving away from not just Russian coal, but gas and oil, and this happens more broadly. I mean, the writing was already on the wall of that, but over a much longer period, because it's, of course, very difficult to do that. But if it's speeded up, there's a huge investment in renewables, and everybody gets serious, well, Russia's sources of revenue for the state start to disappear as well. And they denied the components, for further development of the military. And there's questions, as you had that quote before, that I'm not sure that this generation of Russians, this is the generation that are younger than me, kids' generations, grandchildren generations kind of thing, that they really want to live in that kind of Russia, even if they've rallied around that. And then you get that discontent bubbling. And although, as you said, it's not necessarily that there's going to be a coup, it's kind of hard to envisage that knowing a lot about, Russian history. But it does start to affect participation in the politics and the legitimation of the system. And then people around Putin might say, well, look, we were there because he was popular. He was the linchpin of the system. Maybe somebody else could be that. Maybe somebody else, the other hard guys around him, think, well, you totally messed this up. Somebody wasn't in the chain of decision-making. Well, maybe we need to step up. I remember with Gorbachev, you had, a rather bizarre coup, but you had the old hardliners. There are even harder people than Putin out there. Who were not obsessed about Ukraine, and we've already heard people say what a huge mistake this was. Say, well, that's on you, and this is all on you, and maybe, manoeuvring him off somewhere. But it has consequences, for generations to come. The enmity between Russia and Ukrainians, the knock-on effects on Europe and in Asia, where people are watching this and elsewhere in the world, the, famine that's going to come out of, the impact on grain production and Ukraine, but also Russia and Kazakhstan and the Black Sea and, the kind of all of the exports there. This has got a lot of knock-on effects, and I think we have to be thinking about all of this, just as you're suggesting here. And we have to have a very serious discussion about it, not just about the short term, about, how do we push back, but what does it look like of a Russia that is brought to its knees? We didn't set out to do that. Putin, however, is telling the Russians that that's what we intended to do. He did this. He made that decision. We didn't decide that he should go and invade Ukraine. He did that. But it won't matter for many people about the consequences. And again, thinking about Germany, World War I and World War II, we don't want to perpetuate this cycle. And in a way, Putin is still fighting out World War I. He said it was Lenin and the Bolsheviks, that kind of lost Ukraine. And it's 100 years war. You never know you're in one until you're at the end of it. This is 100 years on from Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the end of the Civil War and the kind of creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, and Putin's still harping on about it. And we want to break that cycle somehow for Russia. And a lot of Russians don't think like that. It's absurd, thinking about what happened to Georgia. Now you've got tens of thousands of Russians in Georgia seeking refuge from Moscow, which is, I think for Georgians is mind-blowing. Kind of as it is, where they're showing up in Kyrgyzstan and Armenia and Azerbaijan, where all the people who previously went to work in Russia are suddenly finding all the Russians coming to them who don't want to be in this kind of Russia. And so we're going to have to think about, how that plays out. The consequences of this are enormous. They really are.
I think that was a $20,000 answer. So look, I think we've got to wrap up. I want to thank the Conduit Club for hosting us. I thank Pranvara Smith for organising this and coming up with this great idea to have these discussions. Thank you to the audience for showing up and asking your very perceptive and thoughtful questions, thought-provoking questions. Most importantly, thank you, Fiona Hill, Dr. Fiona Hill, for joining us. It's really such an honor. I'm a real fan, and I hope you have a really lovely rest of the day and your extra meetings. And please, everyone, the book is for sale at the back. And
thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kelly.